let's talk about just an ordinary dude on this episode of Pushback.
Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pushback. I'm Dr. Jonny, and I'm coming to you after a couple weeks of respite. And I have never really taken a break from this podcast or missed a couple weeks until this moment when I went away with my wife on a Mediterranean cruise to celebrate our 30th anniversary. So it was spectacular, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that on this podcast. My previous podcast before I left was entitled Selah. And Selah means, as you know in the Bible, it means to pause or to reflect. And I am happy to report to you that over these last 2 weeks, I've been able to do just that. And it's so good for the soul to take time to just listen to the Father's voice and what He has for us each and every day. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in the day-to-day, in the momentum of life, some good, some bad, some ugly. But either way, we sometimes lose track of the fact that He's a Father. And He's a good Father. And He loves to talk to His kids and to interact with us and to listen to what's on our heart, and we listen to what's on His heart and have a time just to reflect on His good purposes here in this world. You know, sometimes on this podcast is all about saving the world. And sometimes that can feel overwhelming, and sometimes even my topics might seem very big and grandiose. But I know what the Lord has called me to and has called you to as ambassadors of heaven to reflect His purposes here on this earth. And so I want to run with that with a lot of momentum and with a lot of desire and a lot of enthusiasm. And so I was able to, over the last couple of weeks, just really listen to His heart for this podcast, for our ministry, for my life, and maybe most importantly, for my marriage and for my family. My wife and I just had a tremendous time connecting to each other, listening to each other's hearts, and just enjoying the company of one another and time to look in each other's eyes and time to enjoy just an incredibly beautiful part of the world. If you asked me if you could go one place in the world, where would you go? And I would actually tell you, prior to about 2.5 weeks ago, I would have said Athens. There's something about the ancient nature of the city of Athens that so interests me. And my whole family is just very into history and enjoying history. And we've learned on this podcast that if we don't learn from history, we're destined to repeat it. We've talked about that many times, and it's come up so many times in that cultural aspect in which we live. And so it's interesting to go to a place like Greece that is so ancient. You know, in America, we think 250 years is very old. And when we get into that area of the world, my friends, we're talking 2,500, 3,000 BC. We're talking 5,000 years ago. And it's hard to even get your mind around that. It's hard to even wrap your mind around that much of an ancient environment that they are exposed to there. And of course, my wife and I, we saw all sorts of ruins, but in a lot of ways, we actually followed the footsteps of Paul. It was kind of incredible, the opportunity that we had on excursions when we got off the ship to actually connect with Paul and his journeys all throughout this area. And it's interesting, the impression that it made on me. The impression was staggering in the fact that here's Paul And we're able to see exactly where he was. Now, that might not seem like that big of a deal, but when you're there, it's actually quite moving and gripping, because you realize that here's this man who, we like to look at these Bible figures often, if we're honest, as, stained glass windows, as people with halos around their head, with people that, were almost God-like. Well, when you get into those areas and you see these moments, you realize that he was just an ordinary dude. We were going to Philippi. We say Philippi, they say Philippi. When we went to Philippi, where he would write to the church in Philippians, we saw, of course, Roman ruins. And most of the Roman ruins that you would see all throughout Greece are pretty much set up the same way. They all have a temple to some god. They all have their Roman baths. They have their shopping centers. They have their government centers. And they have their theaters. The Greeks would set up these theaters for drama and for plays and for music. The Romans came in and took these theaters more for gladiatorial purposes. And so they adjusted them and modified them. But most of them had their regular layout. And of course, through the agora, which would be the mall, they had roads that would track through. The Silk Road is a very famous road through the ancient lands. And there was these roads that would connect certain travel areas. And so they know exactly the road that came through Philippi. And we could see this. We know that that's how Paul would have entered this city, is on this road. And on this road, you can see markings from ancient Christianity, the ichthyes, and certain symbols that would demonstrate Jesus, the Son of God. It was beautiful. It was humbling. Our tour guide was walking with us, and he reminded us of the story. He said, the story of Paul when he's in prison, and he's imprisoned, and there's an earthquake, and the doors all swing open, and they can simply walk right out of the prison. And you remember the story that the guard was going to kill himself because any prisoners who escape gets put on the guard, and he would have been killed anyway. And so Paul said, don't worry, you don't need to kill yourself. We're still here. And in fact, we'll go back into prison if you want. And so Paul was pretty cool about it because he just operated in this grace and supernatural realm. And he ends up converting this guard to Christianity. And as the tour guide is telling the story, we come around the corner and he goes, yeah, it happened right there. I almost fell over. I mean, the gravity of the situation where I see a prison cell, and he's like, yeah, it happened here. He goes, if it didn't happen exactly in this cell, it would have been in one of the cells within this 50-foot radius, because they knew where the prison was. Every city was kind of set up the same. And so he said that story took place right here. Paul was imprisoned right here. The supernatural intervention of God took place right here. The conversion of this Roman guard happened right there. And it's such a humbling, incredible, awe-inspiring moment, because you look at somebody like Paul and you realize that he was just a regular guy thrown in prison. Now, we understand the perspective of his life, that he had an absolute encounter with the Almighty God that changed and shifted everything, that gave him such a courage and a grace to enter into these Gentile areas. You guys have to understand, these were Roman-occupied areas, pagan societies that he was bold enough to go into, and he often paid the price for that, like any normal, ordinary dude would. I don't call him an ordinary dude to diminish anything that he did, quite the contrary, because he had a historic boldness about him, and there was a creation and momentum of the church that he helped to usher in. But I want to be very clear, and this is the impression it made on me, is that we are all ordinary dudes, and we've all had an encounter with God. Every one of us who have given our hearts to Jesus has had an encounter with him. We have been apprehended by him and his nature, and he has called us to go into all of the world. and make disciples of all nations, and to teach them like he teaches us. We're all called. And oh, if we would only have that type of boldness. We were on the island of Rhodes, and again, standing up on the Acropolis, the high point of the city that would have been the Roman epicenter. And we're looking down over these cliffs in this beautiful island called Rhodes. And there's a bay. And of course, the tour guide explains to us that there was a weather problem and Paul's ship had to be diverted to Rhodes. And he entered that bay. And now they call it the Bay of St. Paul. They know where he entered. They know when he came. They know what he did when he was here. And he set up a church and left Silas to tend the church while he left and continued on in his journeys. We're in the city of Ephesus. Of course, he would have written the book of Ephesians to. Ephesians is one of the most mind-blowing books there is. And we can see the theater that seats 25,000 people. Like XL Energy Center or the Timberwolves basketball arena, they hold about 18 to 20. This theater holds 25,000 people. Ephesus was an urban metropolis and a bustling port town. And then here comes Paul. And Paul starts causing all sorts of trouble because he is casting out demons and he's healing the sick, and he's doing the things of the kingdom, and it was putting the soothsayers, it was putting the occultists out of business, and their economy was being affected, and they weren't too happy about what Paul was doing. So Paul stands in this theater, the theater that we were at, the very same theater, and he stands there, and these people create a riot around him. You can read about it in the Bible. And they confront him and they speak over him and they do not let him participate in his evangelism. And so his people had to whisk him away. And our tour guide said, hey, look up on that mountain. You can see some rubble of some old houses up there. That's where they took him. They know this. And he escaped and continued on in his journeys. It creates, when you read the Bible, it almost feels like a movie, like you're watching something that's outside of the realm of reality. And yet when you stand there and you see these ruins, when you see these places that Paul was and interacted with people, there's a humbleness that comes on, but also I felt a real encouragement because I too am just an ordinary dude. And I too can carry something for his kingdom. And if I only had the boldness to stand in front of people and to usher in the good news of his gospel and his grace. We're all called to that. And I felt a comfort from the Holy Spirit in those moments. A comfort that said, Johnny boy, like, you're still in that time. We still haven't left this period of the gospel, this period of grace and good news. We're still it. And the world is still hungry. We see the people of Greece and they're Orthodox Greek followers, but it's steeped in superstition and tradition and icons and idols, and it saddens me because this would be considered a Christian country, and I'm not here to judge their hearts or their relationship with the Lord, but it's not what Paul was preaching. Paul was preaching a freedom and a personal relationship with the Almighty God. And the whole Greek culture is immersed in mythology, and they embrace it and they like it. And it's because they're hungry for greater and deeper spiritual things, which Paul brought and which we bring. We went to an old Mycenaean ruins, and this when you get up into these ruins, you have to realize when we talk about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, now we're talking 2,500, 3,000 BC. My friends, we're talking Tower of Babel. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, this is the time period. And of course, it doesn't surprise me that our tour guide takes us up there and she said, yeah, we're high up on a mountain, like snow-capped. I mean, we're way up there. And she said, yeah, at one point they figured that all of this was underwater. And of course, those of us who believe the Bible know exactly what she's talking about. She's talking about Noah's flood. She goes, they're finding seashells up in the mountains. And she said, when you have large amounts of water, the rock gets stirred and all this loose limestoney kind of rock gets stirred around and turns into rubble. And she said it creates perfect building material. So she said these ancient civilizations took the rubble from the flood and built these walls that you're seeing right now. It floors me because it just doesn't feel like that long ago. When you are confronted with the fact that I'm walking through the same gate as the ancient Mycenaeans walked through, then you realize that it just wasn't that long ago. And my friends, here is what I want to encourage you with. We are still living in the times of this world of God and his kingdom. And Jesus, who came to be the King of all kings. And it says one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. But we're still living in that time on this side of the cross of being empowered by his goodness, by his grace, by his mercy, by his love. And we need to realize that our lives matter. All of a sudden, everything felt a little bit closer and more intimate. I can't wait to read the book of Acts again. I can't wait to see where Paul went and his journeys. It just wasn't that long ago. I just looked at them. I just saw them with my own two eyes. I'm not trying to bore you with this podcast about the details of my vacation. But it was more than a vacation. It was an inspiration. It was an eye-opening experience for my wife and I. Every night we would recap over dinner and we'd start weeping. We'd start weeping. The poor waiter probably thought we were having some serious marital crisis or something because we were just recapping the enormity of what we just saw. It's just rock. It's just rubble. It's just old things. And yet there's something about the reminder of what it represented. There's something about the preciousness of what Paul carried that I want for me and for my family. That's what I want. I want to be so moved and stirred by my encounters with Jesus that I would go anywhere for him, do anything, suffer, even to the point of persecution and death. That's really what it comes down to. It comes down to that place of surrender to him and to his heart. We all have to decide whether we're just going to skip through life and live on a cruise ship forever, or we're actually going to get off and move for his purposes. There are moments of Selah that are really nice, where we gather ourselves and we quiet down and listen to what he has for us. But then when he tells us to go, we go and we do the things that he'd have us to do. We're all like Paul. We're all just ordinary dudes. All of us. Just regular people here on this earth. Called to do supernatural things and to be a demonstration. Do you guys realize they had no cell phones? They had no news clips. They had no billboards. All they had were stories. And the magnitude of the gospel of Jesus Christ moved throughout the Mediterranean region because of what God was doing. Did you hear what happened in Ephesus? Do you hear what happened in Philippi? Have you heard in Athens what Paul said and preached from Mars Hill? I saw Mars Hill, where he spoke about the unknown God. Let me tell you about the unknown God. My friends, we are surrounded with people who believe in an unknown God. They're looking for spiritual things. let's be the ones that bring it to them. Let's have our own journeys, our own callings, our own purposes. But make no mistake about it, you have one. You may think, God wouldn't use me. He will use anyone who is drawn to him and identifies as his kids and part of his family. He has called you to do great and wonderful things as just an ordinary, regular person who's equipped with supernatural, extraordinary things. I've got a lot of direction about this podcast and other things with our ministry I'd love to share with you as we go forward. But I'm super excited to be back and to share my heart and continue to share my heart with you about culture and about this world and about being ambassadors of his kingdom. Thank you again so much for listening. Hey, would you go to Facebook and find us? GoFam Ministries. You also can find us on Instagram. And most importantly, go to our website, gofam.org. It's all just new and revamped. Gofam.org, and you'll find where we are, where we're speaking, our resources, and great opportunities to connect. And finally, go to pushbackculture.org if you'd like to leave a comment about this podcast, other podcasts, or future topics you would love to hear discussed. I'd love to hear from you. So let's go together now to set and shape the culture.